Please help me in welcoming our guest speaker, Glen Hodgson.
Thanks very much, Bill. I always wonder who that guy is when I get introduced like that. Sorry about the McGill reference, all you Queens guys. So I live in the Middle Kingdom. I live in Ottawa, so I'm here to help you. I always wanted to use that line too. I've actually spoken in Eastern Ontario 2 or 3 times. I was invited by people in Cobourg to talk at a couple of events there, so it's really nice to be back to share with you what I think is happening in the world economy. So in half an hour, I'm going to tell you about the world in 1 slide, the U.S. in 5, Canada in 10, and spend the rest talking about Ontario and Eastern Ontario. So hold on to your hats. We're going to go fast. So right now, we are in a recovery period. Regardless of whatever you read in the newspaper, it's actually, the world economy is recovering. Some have called this a love recovery, L-U-V. I tried to say that in Quebec yesterday. It didn't go down so well. L'économie amour. L is Europe. Sharp down, very flat recovery. And the L is even flatter because of what's happened in Greece, the Greek tragedy rolling out. I don't know if you read the paper this morning, but the Brits just brought in their budget with the coalition government. They've increased their sales taxes in Britain by 2.5 percentage points one go. And almost all departments except health are going to have a cutback of 25%. And they're still going to only balance their budget in 2016. So that's an indication how bad things are in Europe right now. Britain and the United States were arguably the 2 places hit hardest, the 2 big economies hit hardest by the financial crisis, recession. We won't talk about Iceland or Ireland or Greece. But it's really tough stuff going on in Europe right now. So that's the L. The U is North America. I'll show you, we're actually partway up the recovery side of the U. Things are looking pretty good. We're forecasting, in fact, I'll tell you now, growth of over 3.5% this year in Canada, and about 3% in the United States. So that looks like a recovery to me. There is still a lot of risk out there. There could be a second dip, but I think the chance of having a double-dip recession is kind of 1 in 20. It's really a low probability, in part because the U.S. government will do whatever it has to ensure that growth happens in the United States. And the V is in the emerging markets. So I've got the Japanese in there as an L as well. Japan is a particular tragedy because they are both aging very quickly. They don't know how to replace their workforce. And they've had, frankly, bad policy for about 20 years now. And so Japan may be another country which will have a fiscal crisis at some point. You heard it here first. And then the V, the really good story, is emerging markets. And it's not just China. There's a China story, but it's India, it's Brazil, it's Indonesia. There's probably about 130 countries you can put on the list, which will have growth rates of between 5 and 8 or 10%. And that really, I've called that the shifting tectonic plates of the global economy, where the rules are now fundamentally changing. We're going to see that at the G20. That's why the G20 exists, why that armed camp called Toronto is going to have so much fun this weekend. But it really reflects the fact that the rules have changed in the way the world is organized. And countries like China and India now demand a seat at the table, and they want a lot of voting power. And that's the world we're entering. So that's the new normal. Not much growth in the old world, and a really dynamic emerging world. Okay, so that's my 1 slide on the world. U.S. The U.S. is actually recovering now. The U.S. has gone through a really difficult patch, though. It's quite obvious from reading the papers that Americans are in great pain. Think about what's happened to the average American over the last 2 years. They've lost probably 25% of their retirement portfolio. If you live in Southern California, Vegas, Arizona, or Florida, you lost 50% of the value of your home, 50%. And it's going to stay there for a lot of time to come. And now your neighbors are getting laid off. Unemployment jumped from 4% to 10%. So Americans were feeling real bad, as they say in the States. And it really took the incredible stimulus of the Obama stimulus package, $800 billion spent over the last year, and then interest rates that are at 0 and probably going to stay there another year to get the U.S. economy going again. So things are happening, moving in the right direction, but arguably it's the wrong kind of growth. It's still driven by that incredible monetary and fiscal stimulus, not enough by private sector activity. Jobs are coming back, and I'll show you a slide in a second. Private investment, though, is still kind of waiting in the wings. And America is building a huge fiscal challenge for itself as they go down the road. And, we're probably looking at another 6 months to a year of that incredible stimulus to make sure that growth becomes firmly rooted or firmly seated in the United States. So, a few charts, because I am an economist. Economists always have to have their charts. So this is what a housing bubble looks like to an economist. You can look at the purple bars, those are sales. So at the peak there, spring of 2005, 1 in 3 of all mortgages in the United States was a so-called subprime mortgage. I call them ninja mortgages, no income, job, or assets. People were walking into the bank and borrowing $200,000 on a speculative property, not even showing their pay stub. And bankers were willing to actually make those loans. That was all bundled up by the smart guys on Wall Street and sold around the world. And that's how subprime got shared with the entire global financial system, which is why we saw investment banks fail, we saw banks fail in the US and across Europe, and the run will still go on. So the peak there, collapse of sales, over the last year sales have improved a little bit, but look how choppy it is. So I'm now showing positive growth when it comes to the US housing market, but from a very low base, and the yellow line is prices, and you can see that for the average American, prices have actually not improved that much over the last year. So we probably hit the floor, and things are heading in the right direction. But it's really tough, and if you go to Phoenix or go to Vegas or go to Orlando and check out the newspapers, it's incredible what properties you can buy, but they're half price. And they're probably going to stay that way for the next 3 to 5 years as things solidify and begin to improve a little bit. There's been a bit of improvement in mortgage demand. Housing starts have actually risen by about that much in the US. But I saw a report today saying again that prices had fallen a bit in a couple of these so-called stand-state markets. Those 4 southern markets are the ones which were largely speculative markets driven by property speculation. So that's what caused the financial crisis and the recession. This is the consequence. America lost 8 million jobs, peak to trough. Good news, though. Look at the far right side. They've actually started creating jobs the last 3 or 4 months. So finally we're heading the right direction. Some debate about whether the right kind of jobs. Of the jobs, there's 450,000 jobs approximately created in May. Trouble is, 90% of them were census takers. So only 40,000 real jobs. And that's not a very good story if you want a sustainable recovery. And that's why you keep hearing rumors of the Congress voting in another stimulus package, because Americans are worried. And all this comes at a huge price. Here's the price. Annual deficits are now up to $1.6 trillion. We're showing sort of 1.3, 1.4 on an annualized basis. So America has a huge structural deficit. That's what happens when you have to go out and basically borrow your brains out to kickstart your economy. So I think the US government and governments around the world did the right thing with stimulus. We were in a very deep hole, but it comes at a price. America now is looking at a structural deficit of about $1 trillion. That's $1,000 billion ongoing without action. And if you read the media at all, watch CNN, you see how divisive the US Congress is right now, where, Obama couldn't get one Republican to actually vote for his health package going through. So things are incredibly polarized. He's created an independent panel to go out and look at American fiscal reform going forward. But I think things may have to get worse before they get better, because right now there is no popular consensus in favor of addressing the fiscal problem. That's still for a year really a year from now. America has to go through another year of stimulating to really get growth firmed up. But that's a huge challenge going forward. And that means that there will be pressure on interest rates over the medium term. Because with US government borrowing $1 trillion, the Brits borrowing between 100 and 150 billion pounds annually, and governments on top of that. So you have that incredible public sector borrowing, and then you add private investment coming back. That's going to put a lot of pressure on global financial markets. And for me, that means higher interest rates. And I'll talk more about that when I get to the Canada slides. So overall growth, we actually are showing growth of 3% in the US this year, even a little bit better next year. The question is, how does it make the transition from public sector to private sector? I see I have your attention. That's very good. It's kind of a scary story. And the challenge, of course, going forward is if you don't address the fiscal problem, it'll pull growth down because there'll be very low expectations in consumers and investors. People won't have much confidence in the economy going forward. So big, big challenge. I really don't expect it to be addressed actually by this Obama government. We'll go through another election cycle and we'll see who the lucky guy is who gets the prize of having to address America's fiscal problem down the road. Canada, we went through the same kind of cycle, but our fundamentals were in much better shape. We actually started creating jobs in Canada in June of last year. Even though our economy contracted by as much as the US, percentage terms, we didn't lose one bank. We only had one financial institution where there was a fundamental change of management next door, CDP Capital. And of course, we're in a much stronger fiscal position. So we come out of this in better shape. We're now the first G7 country, they still exist, to start raising interest rates. So there's lots of challenges, but we're forecasting growth. We do a quarterly cycle of our forecast for Canada and for the provinces. And my guys came in on Monday and said, guess what? We actually have growth up to 3.6% now for 2010, and not quite as strong for next year, but 2 pretty good years. Good, but not great. After a recession like we had, normally you would have a growth year of sort of 4.5%, 5%, as consumers and investors basically catch up with denied consumption and investment. That's being muted this time because we have to start saving. We know that our governments are going to have to deal with fiscal challenges down the road. So that's muting some of the effect. But we do have certain provinces, and we're living in the one that's the biggest challenge, facing a big, big fiscal challenge. And that's going to be one of the stories I'm going to tell about Eastern Ontario. So quickly, was there a Great Recession? Well, here's the story if you actually measure the loss of GDP and the loss of jobs. I think we've forgotten how to do recessions. We went so long since the last one. The kids have never seen a recession. You ask your employees 30 or under, they've only seen good times. So some of the overreaction was we just didn't know what a recession looks like. So this time it was bad. Of course it's bad. But the job loss was much less severe in Canada. I mentioned 8 million jobs lost in the U.S. There was 400,000 peak to trough in Canada. And in fact, we're now creating jobs at a fairly rapid rate. Quebec has replaced all the jobs that they lost and have added about another 10%. In Ontario, we're not quite back to where we started, but we're heading the right direction. So that's a much less severe story than anybody feared if you go back a year.